The Vethkai Dominion had ruled their section of the galaxy for 6,000 years, and in all that time, they had never once considered humans to be anything more than a minor annoyance. They were a young species, barely 200 years into space. Travel and their colonies numbered only 12 across the Outer Rim territories, where no major power bothered to expand new. Elysium was the smallest of these colonies, and it sat on a rocky world rich in rare minerals that humanity needed for their growing civilization. The colony had started as a mining outpost, but over 50 years, it had grown into something more, and families had come to build lives there, and children had been born under alien stars, and the population had reached 2.3 million souls, who called this distant world their home. Admiral Kethvoran of the Vethkai Third Fleet received word that human miners had breached what his people called a sacred boundary, and this was a region of space that the Dominion had claimed thousands of years ago, though they had never bothered to mark it on any galactic charts. The humans had not known, and they could not have known, but Kethvoran did not care about such details. He saw an opportunity to remind the galaxy that the Vethkai were still the dominant force in this region, and he assembled 40 warships and set course for New Elysium. The colony had no military vessels, because humanity had not yet learned to fear the stars and their orbital defenses consisted of 3 aging platforms designed to deflect asteroids rather than warships. Governor Sarah Chun was drinking her morning coffee when the alarms began to sound, and she rushed to the command center where her staff watched in horror as 40 alien warships dropped out of hyperspace and formed a ring around their world. She opened the communication channel immediately, and her voice was calm despite the fear that gripped her heart. Vethkai vessels, this is Governor Chun of New Elysium, and we have no hostile intentions. And if we have violated your territory, it was done in ignorance, and we are willing to discuss any grievances. You may have Admiral Kethvoran's face appeared on her screen, and his features were sharp and angular with pale blue skin and eyes that held nothing but contempt. Human, he said, you have trespassed on sacred ground, and the penalty is death. And your kind must learn that insects do not share space with gods. Sarah Chun's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. Admiral, please, and there are over 2 million civilians on this world, and we have children and families, and we pose no threat to your Dominion, and surely we can find a peaceful solution. Kethvoran smiled, and it was the smile of someone who enjoyed the power he held over weaker beings. Your deaths will be the peaceful solution, and when your survivors carry word back to Earth, your species will understand its place in the galaxy. The communication cut off, and Sarah Chun turned to her staff with tears forming in her eyes. Begin emergency evacuation protocols, and get as many people to the shelters as possible, and send a distress call to Earth. But there was no time, and there was never going to be enough time. The Vethkai opened fire, and their weapons tore through the orbital platforms in seconds, and debris rained down on the northern continent like burning stars. Then the bombardment of the surface began. They did not target military installations because there were none, and they did not strike at defensive positions because none existed, and instead they aimed at the cities and the towns and the places where families lived and children played. New Elysium City was the first to die, and its towers of glass and steel melted under plasma fire, and 300,000 people vanished in an instant. Governor Chun watched from the command bunker as her world burned around her, and she held her 7-year-old daughter Myra close to her chest and whispered words of comfort that she did not believe. It will be okay, sweetheart, and help is coming, and everything will be okay. The bombardment continued for 6 hours, and the Vethkai were thorough in their work. They turned forests to ash and oceans to steam and cities to craters of molten glass, and they hunted down evacuation ships and destroyed them one by one as families tried desperately to escape when it was over 99% of New Elysium's population was dead. Kethvorn had his crew identify one transport ship that had managed to hide in the shadow of a moon, and he gave orders to let it go. "Fill it with survivors," he commanded, "and let them carry our message back to Earth." His soldiers gathered 847 survivors from the ruins, and they were burned and broken and traumatized beyond measure, and among them was little Myra Chun, who clutched a photograph of her parents that had been scorched by fire. Her mother had pushed her into a rescue worker's arms moments before a plasma blast had taken her life, and her father had died in the first wave of bombardment, and Mira was alone in a way that no child should ever be. The transport ship limped away from the graveyard that had once been New Elysium, and Admiral Kethvorn broadcast a message to the Galactic Assembly. "Let all species witness what happens to those who challenge the Vethkai dominion, and the human infestation has been reminded of its place, and we trust no further lessons will be necessary." The galaxy received this message with quiet acceptance because the Vethkai were powerful and humanity was weak. And this was simply the way of things. 3 weeks later, the transport arrived at Earth. Station Prime and the survivors were met by a delegation led by Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo, who was the highest-ranking military officer in human space. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, but those eyes turned hard as stone when he heard the survivors tell their stories. Little Mira Chun stood before him, still holding her burned photograph, and she looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much horror for someone so young. Admiral Okonkwo knelt down so that he was at her level, and he spoke softly. "What is your name, child?" "Myra," she whispered. "Myra Chun, and my mommy and daddy are gone." Okonkwo felt something break inside his chest, and something else harden in its place. He took the little girl's hand in his own, and he made a promise that would change the course of galactic history. "Mira, I swear to you on my life and on my honor that what happened to your world will never happen again, and those who did this will learn what humanity does to those who murder our children, and we will not forget, and we will not forgive, and we will make them understand that they made the worst mistake in the history of their civilization when they decided to harm our people." Mira looked at him with eyes full of tears, and she did not fully understand his words, but she understood that this man meant every single one of them. Admiral Okonkwo stood and turned to his officers, and his voice was cold and hard. "Send word to every government on Earth and every colony in human space, and tell them that everything has changed, and tell them that we have work to do. The age of human innocence had ended in fire and blood, and the age of human vengeance was about to begin." The galaxy forgot about New Elysium within a single year because small tragedies happen every day among the stars, and the powerful do not remember the suffering of the weak. Admiral Kethvorn returned to a hero's welcome on the Wastars, and the powerful do not remember the suffering of the weak. Admiral Kethvorn returned to a hero's welcome on the Majvus, Vethkai homeworld, and he was celebrated for teaching the young human species their proper place in the cosmic order. The Galactic Assembly recorded the incident as a minor border dispute, and no sanctions were imposed and no condemnations were issued because the Vethkai were too valuable as trading partners and humanity was too insignificant to matter. Earth's representatives quietly withdrew from galactic forums, and human ships became rare in major ports, and human diplomats stopped attending interstellar conferences. The other species assumed that humanity had been broken by the display of overwhelming force, and this was exactly what they, Vethkai, had intended. Xenoanthropologists from the prestigious Morvathi Institute published papers predicting that human civilization would collapse within a century, and they described humanity as a failed experiment, and a species that had expanded too quickly and been crushed before they could mature. These scholars could not have been more wrong. Behind the veil of silence, Earth had transformed in ways that no alien intelligence could have predicted. 6 months after the New Elysium massacre, every nation on Earth had signed the Unity Accord, and for the first time in human history, the species spoke with one voice. The United Terran Coalition was born, and its first act was the creation of the Vengeance Protocol. Admiral James Okonkwo was appointed Supreme Commander of all Terran military forces, and he addressed humanity in a broadcast that reached every corner of human space. Our brothers and sisters on New Elysium were murdered because we were weak, and they were slaughtered because the galaxy believed we could not fight back, and their children were burned alive because alien power saw us as insects to be crushed. His voice grew hard and cold as iron. We will never be weak again, and we will build a force so vast and so terrible that no species will ever dare to raise a hand against humanity. And when we are ready, we will return to Vethkai space, and we will show them what insects can do when you give them a reason to swarm. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every shipyard on Earth switched to military production overnight, and factories that had built consumer goods began producing weapons and armor and the components of warships. But Earth alone was not enough for what Okonkwo had planned. The asteroid belt became humanity's forge, and massive stations were constructed among the rocks. And these stations pulled minerals from asteroids and transformed them into the bones of warships. Jupiter's moons were colonized not for science, but for industry and the gas giant's resources. Fueled furnaces that burned day and night, Mars had a struggling colony of 3 million people, and within 2 years, its population had grown to 50 million workers who built ships beneath the red soil. Every human colony in the outer territories redirected their economies toward a single purpose, and miners who had once sought fortune now sought vengeance. The children of New Elysium became a rallying cry across human space, and every warship that rolled off the production lines bore the names of the dead inscribed on their hulls. Mira Chun had been adopted by Admiral Okonkwo himself, and she grew up in the shadow of the greatest military buildup in human history. She watched as humanity transformed itself from scattered colonists into a unified war machine, and she understood that all of this was being done in memory of her parents and the millions who had died beside them. The Vethkai had believed they were teaching humanity a lesson about weakness, but instead they had taught humanity a lesson about strength. Humans had always been good at war, and it was perhaps their greatest and most terrible gift for 10,000 years. They had refined the art of killing each other, and they had invented weapons that could crack continents and strategies that could topple empires, and they had fought wars so terrible that their own planet had nearly been destroyed. Now, for the first time, the collective genius turned outward toward the stars. Scientists who had spent their careers on peaceful research now designed weapons that could tear through alien shields, and engineers who had built homes and hospitals now built engines of destruction. The numbers grew year by year in secret, and the Vethkai intelligence services detected nothing because they were not looking. Why would they look, and why would they worry about a broken species that had retreated from galactic affairs? In the 5th year of the Vengeance Protocol, humanity had 10,000 warships. In the 7th year, they had 50,000 in the 9th year. They had 100,000 as still the forges burned, and still the shipyards produced, and still humanity. Remembered Admiral Okonkwo had done a calculation after watching the recordings of New Elysium's destruction, and he had counted every soul who had died, and he had made a decision about how humanity would respond. 2.3 million people had been murdered. For every life taken, humanity would build 200 warships. The math was simple, and the goal was absolute. And when Okonkwo presented this plan to the Coalition Council, they approved it without a single dissenting vote. Construction continued in silence and secrecy, and the galaxy remained blind to what was building in human space. Occasionally, Vethkai merchant ships would pass through human territory, and they would see cargo freighters and mining vessels, and nothing that suggested military strength. They did not know that the cargo freighters were carrying components for warships, and they did not know that the mining vessels were feeding ore to hidden forges, and they did not know that beneath the surface of human worlds, entire fleets were being assembled. Mira Chun turned 17 in the 10th year of the protocol, and by then she had begun training as a diplomatic officer because Okonkwo believed that humanity would need voices of peace as well as weapons of war. She studied alien languages and cultures, and she learned the art of negotiation, and she prepared herself for a future that would come after the vengeance was complete. But she also learned to fight because every human learned to fight. Now, and the species that had been dismissed as weak was forging itself into something that the galaxy had never seen. On the eve of the 11th year, Admiral Okonkwo received the final production reports, and he sat alone in his office aboard the flagship, Tien's Remembrance, and he looked at the numbers. 500,000 warships ready for deployment, and each one crewed by humans who had volunteered knowing they might die, and each one armed with weapons that human ingenuity had created in secret. The Vethkai had brought 40 ships to destroying New Elysium. Humanity was about to bring 500,000 ships to answer that crime. Okonkwo opened the communication channel to all fleet commanders across human space. "The silent decade is over," he said, "and the time for preparation has ended. And now begins the time for justice, and all ships will begin moving to assembly coordinates, and in 30 days we march on Vethkai space, and in 30 days, the galaxy learns what happens when you give humanity a reason to fight." Across 100 worlds, human warships rose from hidden docks and secret shipyards, and they moved through space like a tide of steel. The insects were ready to swarm. The merchant vessel Kethrel's Pride dropped out of hyperspace near the human colony of Redemption's Landing, expecting to find the same quiet backwater it had visited many times before. Instead, Captain Yethvora found herself surrounded by 300 warships that had not existed 11 years ago. She stared at her sensor display with wide eyes as human vessels moved into formation around her. Ship and their weapons were powered and their shields were raised, and they looked nothing like the crude cargo haulers she had seen on previous visits. These were warships designed for one purpose, and that purpose was destruction. "This is the Terran Coalition vessel Judgment." A cold human voice came through her communication system. "You have entered restricted space, and you will power down your engines and prepare for inspection." Captain Yethvora complied immediately because she was not a fool, and 300 warships could reduce her merchant vessel to atoms in seconds. The inspection was thorough but not violent, and the humans took detailed scans of her ship and asked many questions about Vethkai military positions and fleet movements. When they released her, Captain Yethvora made the fastest hyperspace jump of her life back to Dominion territory. Her report reached Vethkai intelligence within hours, and it set off a chain of events that would shake the galaxy to its core. At first, the intelligence officers dismissed her claims as the ravings of a Budjans. Frightened merchant and 300 warships was impossible, because their records showed humanity possessed fewer than 50 military vessels. But more reports began to arrive from other regions of human space, and each report was more alarming. Then the last Vethkai scout ship had detected a formation of 500 human warships near the Terminus system. A trading station on the border had observed over 1,000 human vessels passing through in a single day. A long-range sensor array had picked up energy signatures consistent with a fleet of over 10,000 ships moving through deep space. The Vethkai High Command dispatched their best intelligence vessel to conduct a proper survey of human territory, and what it found defied all logic and reason. Human space had transformed into a fortress of steel and fire. Shipyards the size of small moons orbited gas. Giants producing warships at a rate that seemed physically impossible. Asteroid fields had been converted into weapons factories that stretched across millions of kilometers. Every human colony bristled with orbital defense platforms and ground-based weapon systems in the ships, and there were so many ships. The intelligence vessel counted over 100,000 warships before its captain decided he had seen enough and fled back to report. This report could not be dismissed, and it landed on the desk of Admiral Kethforan himself, who was now elderly, but still commanded the Dominion's primary battle fleet. He read the numbers 3 times, and then he laughed. "Quantity is not quality," he told the High Command. "The humans have built many ships, yes, but their technology is primitive, and their tactics are crude, and they build coffins, not warships, and if they are foolish enough to challenge us, we will destroy them as easily as we destroyed their pathetic colony." Not everyone in the Vethkai leadership shared his confidence. Several younger admirals argued for a diplomatic approach, and they suggested that perhaps the destruction of New Elysium had been too harsh, and perhaps some gesture of reconciliation could prevent what was clearly coming. Kethforan silenced them with a wave of his hand. "We do not apologize to insects," he declared. "If the humans want war, then we will give them war, and we will crush their fleet and burn their worlds. And this time, we will not leave survivors to carry tales." The Galactic Assembly watched these developments with growing unease. The Thrall Confederacy quietly withdrew their ambassadors from Vethkai space, and their diplomats offered no explanation for this sudden departure. The Morvathi Trading Consortium began redirecting shipping lanes away from any system that might become a battlefield, and they had survived for thousands of years by avoiding the wars of more aggressive species. The ancient Kethmari, elders who had not spoken in a century, sent a single message to the Vethkai High Command. "You woke something that should have been left sleeping, and now you will reap what you have sown." Ambassador Yeltrix of the Neutral Worlds requested an audience with Supreme Commander Okonkwo in a desperate attempt to prevent catastrophe. She was granted permission to board the Tien's Remembrance, which she learned was a dreadnought whose hull bore the names of every soul lost on New Elysium. The names were written in letters small enough that there were millions of them covering every surface of the massive warship. Okonkwo received her on the bridge, surrounded by officers who watched the alien diplomat with cold eyes. "Ambassador," he said, "I assume you come with a message from the Assembly." Yeltrix tried to keep her voice steady, but something about this human commander unsettled her in ways she could not explain. "Supreme Commander, the Assembly urges restraint, and the Vethkai can be brought to negotiation, and reparations can be discussed, and territory can be exchanged. And there is no need for a war that will cost millions of lives on both sides." Okonkwo was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was soft but carried a weight that made Yeltrix step backward. "Ambassador, do you know what the Vethkai call New Elysium now? And it is in their official records, and they call it a successful pest removal, and they gave Admiral Kethforan a medal for murdering 2.3 million civilians." He turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his eyes that made her understand why her government had been so desperate to prevent this confrontation. This was not anger, and this was not hatred, and this was something far more dangerous. This was certainty. "We are not coming to negotiate," Okonkwo continued. "We are not coming to discuss reparations, and we are not coming to exchange territory, and we are coming to deliver a lesson that the galaxy will never forget." "What lesson?" Yeltrix whispered. "That humanity is not to be tested, and that those who harm our children will face consequences beyond their imagination, and that the species they dismissed as insects has spent 11 years preparing a response that will reshape the balance of power in this galaxy forever." Yeltrix had one final question. "How many ships, Commander, and how many ships are you bringing?" Okonkwo smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. 500,000 warships, Ambassador, and one for every 4 humans who died on New Elysium, and I want you to return to the Assembly and tell them that number, and tell them what is coming, and tell them to stay out of our way. Ambassador. Yeltrix returned to the Neutral Worlds and delivered her report, and the Galactic Assembly collectively held its breath. The storm that had been gathering for 11 years was about to break, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. Kepher Prime had stood at the center of the Vethkai Dominion for 6,000 years, and it was a world of impossible beauty with crystal towers that touched the clouds and gardens that stretched across continents and oceans so blue they looked like liquid sapphires. 20 billion Vethkai called this world home, and they had never known war on their soil, because their military had always kept enemies far from their borders. The planet was protected by defense platforms that had been built over millennia, and these platforms had never been tested in actual combat, because no enemy had ever been foolish enough to approach. 300 warships orbited the homeworld as a ceremonial guard, and Admiral Kethvorn had gathered the rest of the Dominion fleet at staging points throughout their territory. He expected the humans to attack their outer colonies first, and he had prepared a trap that would catch the human fleet in a crossfire and destroy them before they could threaten anything important. He was wrong about everything. At exactly 0600 Galactic Standard Time, the sky above Kepler Prime began to tear itself apart. Hyperspace ruptures are normally small and controlled, and they appear as brief flashes of light as ships transition from faster than light travel to normal space. What happened above the Vethkai homeworld was something else entirely. The first rupture was massive, and it stretched across thousands of kilometers, and from it emerged 10,000 human warships in perfect formation. Before the Vethkai defense coordinator could even process what he was seeing, a second rupture opened and another 10,000 ships poured through. Then a third rupture and a fourth and a fifth, and the sky filled with warships that blotted out the stars. Defense Coordinator Vethinaler stood in his command center and watched his sensor display with growing horror as he tried to count the contacts appearing around his world. 10,000, he reported to the High Command. 20,000 and 40,000, and they are still coming, and 60,000 and 80,000. His voice began to crack as the numbers continued to climb. 100,000 and 150,000 and 200,000 warships, and this is impossible, and this cannot be happening. But it was happening, and the ruptures continued to open and more ships continued to pour through. 300,000. Vethinaler's hands were shaking now. 350,000 and 400,000 and 450,000. He paused, and his next words were barely a whisper. 470,000 and 480,000 and 490,000. And they are still coming. And how is this possible? And how? The final count settled at 500,000 warships. 500,000 vessels of war surrounded the Vethkai homeworld in a sphere of steel and death that stretched beyond the horizon. In every direction, Admiral Kethvorn received word of the attack on his personal communicator, and for the first time in his long life, he felt something he had never experienced before: fear. He immediately ordered his scattered fleet to converge on the homeworld, but he knew they would arrive too late to matter. The 300 ships guarding Kepler Prime were all that stood between humanity and everything the Vethkai held dear. Kethvorn opened a channel to his flagship captain. Engage the human fleet, he commanded. All ships attack and show these insects what Vethkai warriors can do. It was the last order he would ever give. The 300 Vethkai warships had been the pride of their civilization for generations, and each one was crewed by veterans who had trained their entire lives for battle. They moved forward in perfect formation, and their weapons charged and their shields raised, and they prepared to defend their homeworld or die trying. The human fleet did not react like any enemy the Vethkai had ever faced. They did not swarm chaotically, and they did not break formation, and they did not show any sign of the fear that the Vethkai expected from a younger species. Instead, the human ships advanced in a wall of absolute precision, and each vessel moved in perfect synchronization with every other vessel, and the wall of warships closed around the Vethkai defenders like a fist closing around an insect. The first Vethkai ship to engage was the heavy cruiser Dominance, and it had served the Empire for 400 years, and its weapons had destroyed hundreds of enemy vessels across dozens of campaigns. The Dominance fired everything it had at the nearest human formation and its plasma. Cannons lit up space with brilliant purple fire. The shots struck the shields of a human destroyer, and the shields flickered, but held. Then the human fleet responded. 400 human warships fired simultaneously at the Dominance, and they're coordinated. Volleys struck the Vethkai cruiser from every direction at once. The Dominance's shields, which had been rated to withstand asteroid impacts, lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. The ship itself lasted another half second before it was reduced to expanding gas and debris. The other Vethkai captains watched in horror as one of their mightiest vessels was erased from existence in less than 3 seconds. But they were warriors, and they had their orders, and they continued to fight. It did not matter. The human fleet had spent 11 years preparing for this moment, and every tactic had been rehearsed, and every formation had been practiced, and every ship knew exactly what to do when a Vethkai vessel fired on one section of the human line. Hundreds of human ships would concentrate their fire on that single enemy, and the Vethkai ship would simply cease to exist. The shields that the Vethkai had believed were impenetrable failed instantly under the weight of coordinated fire from so many sources. Their weapons, which had dominated the stars for millennia, could not even scratch the paint on human hulls when hundreds of human ships were pouring fire back at them. The battle for Kethver Prime lasted 4 hours and not a single Vethkai military vessel remained operational. Their orbital defense platforms, which had stood for thousands of years, were dust. Their shipyards, which had built the warships of their empire, were debris. Their 300 defenders had been swept aside like leaves before a hurricane. Admiral Kethvorin died when his flagship was hit by simultaneous fire from over 1,000 human vessels, and the ship that had terrorized New Elysium was destroyed so completely that no piece larger than a fist remained. The greatest military force the Vethkai had ever assembled had been utterly annihilated. And then the human fleet stopped. They did not fire on the planet, and they did not destroy the civilian stations, and they did not slaughter the billions of Vethkai who looked up at the sky in terror. They simply waited. Supreme Commander Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the TNS Remembrance and looked down at the world that lay helpless before him. His weapons officer reported that all military targets had been neutralized, and the planet's defenses were completely destroyed, sir. The officer said, "We have clear firing solutions on all major population centers, and we can begin orbital bombardment on your command." Okonkwo was silent for a long moment. He thought about New Elysium, and he thought about the 2.3 million people who had died, and he thought about little Marichun holding her burned photograph. He thought about what the Vethkai would have done if their positions were reversed, and then he made the decision that would define humanity for generations to come. "Hold fire," he said. "Open a channel to the planet's surface and prepare to broadcast on all frequencies." The weapons officer looked confused. "Sir, we have them, and we can end this, and we can make sure they never threaten anyone again." Okonkwo turned to face his officer, and his eyes were hard, but his voice was steady. "I know what we can do, and I also know what we will do, and now open that channel." The channel opened, and humanity spoke to the Vethkai for the first time since New Elysium. Supreme Commander Okonkwo's voice echoed across every frequency on Kethvar Prime, and it reached every city and every home and every terrified citizen who looked up at the sky filled with human warships. "People of the Vethkai Dominion, hear my words and understand what I am about to say. 20 billion Vethkai stopped what they were doing and listened because they had no choice and because they expected to hear their death sentence pronounced by the species they had dismissed as insects. 11 years ago, your forces came to a human world called New Elysium, and they murdered 2.3 million of our people. And these were not soldiers, and these were not warriors, and these were families and children and people who had done nothing wrong except exist too close to your borders." Okonkwo paused, and the silence stretched across the planet. Your Admiral Cathvorin called it pest removal, and your government gave him medals, and your records describe it as a successful operation, and you believed that you had taught humanity its place in the galaxy. His voice hardened. You were wrong. Today we have demonstrated what we are capable of, and your fleet is destroyed, and your defenses are gone, and your homeworld lies helpless beneath our guns, and every city on your planet is within range of our weapons, and we could reduce your civilization to ash in hours. The Vethkai who listened felt their hearts stop, because they knew this was true, and they knew they could do nothing to prevent it. We choose otherwise. A murmur of confusion rippled across the planet because this was not what they had expected to hear. Humanity does not wage war against children, and we do not bomb innocent civilians to send messages, and we do not slaughter the helpless and call ourselves gods, and we do not murder families and call it pest removal. Okonkwo's voice grew softer, but somehow more powerful. We are not you. Your military is destroyed, and your ability to threaten anyone has ended, and your empire will collapse, because you built it on fear and fear alone. And when that fear is broken, nothing remains. But your people will live, and your children will grow up, and your civilization will continue. And it will be marked forever by this day, but it will survive. The commander drew a deep breath before delivering his final words. 11 years ago, you took everything from the people of New Elysium, and today, we could take everything from you. And instead, we give you something that you never gave us: mercy. This is the difference between humanity and those who thought us insects, and we have the power to destroy. And we choose not to use it, and we have every reason for vengeance, and we choose to show restraint. Remember this day, and remember what we could have done, and remember what we chose to do instead. And teach your children and your children's children that humanity is not to be tested. We are leaving now, and we will not return unless you give us reason. And if you ever harm another innocent human being, we will come back, and next time there will be no mercy, and next time there will be no speech, and next time there will only be fire. This is our justice for New Elysium, and may the galaxy remember it forever. The communication ended, and the human fleet began to withdraw. 500,000 warships turned away from the helpless planet and began moving toward hyperspace jump points, and within hours, they were gone. The Vethkai looked up at empty skies, and they could not understand what had happened. They had been prepared to die, and they had expected extinction, and instead the humans had simply left. In the days that followed, the Dominion collapsed not from destruction, but from the complete loss of everything that had held it together. Their military was gone, and their reputation was shattered. And the species they had conquered over millennia saw weakness where once they had seen strength. The Vethkai Empire fragmented into dozens of smaller states, and each one struggled to survive in a galaxy that no longer feared them. The Galactic Assembly restructured itself around a new understanding, and every species learned the lesson that humanity had taught. Do not test the humans, and do not harm their people, and do not mistake their kindness for weakness. New species entering galactic civilization were quietly taken aside and told the story of New Elysium and Cathvar Prime. The humans are a young species, the elder races would explain, and they are often friendly and curious and eager to trade and cooperate, but there is something in them that you must never awaken, and if you harm their children, they will build a fleet to answer that harm, and they will find you no matter where you hide. Earth built a memorial for New Elysium at the center of their capital city, and it was a vast garden of white stone and clear water, and its heart stood a statue of a young girl holding a burned photograph. Myra Chun had grown into a woman of remarkable strength and compassion, and she had become the first human ambassador to the reformed Galactic Assembly. She was chosen because she represented everything humanity wanted to be, and she was a survivor who had chosen hope over hatred and peace over vengeance on the 10th anniversary of the Day of Wrath. Mira stood before the memorial and delivered a speech that was broadcast across the galaxy. I was 7 years old when the Vethkai destroyed my world, and I watched my mother die. And I lost my father, and I spent years consumed by grief and anger. She looked at the statue of herself as a child, and her eyes glistened with tears. Admiral Okonkwo took me in and raised me as his own daughter, and I grew up surrounded by preparations for war, and I watched humanity transform itself into something that could shake the foundations of galactic civilization. And when the day came and when our fleet surrounded the Vethkai homeworld, and when we had the power to do to them what they had done to us, I thought I would want destruction. She paused and composed herself. I was wrong. Commander Okonkwo came to me before he made his final decision, and he asked me what I wanted. And I thought about my parents, and I thought about the millions who died beside them. And I thought about the children on Kethver Prime who had done nothing wrong. And I realized that my parents would not have wanted their memory honored with genocide. And they were kind people who believed in building rather than destroying. And they would have wanted humanity to be better than our enemies. So I told Commander Okonkwo to spare them, and I told him that mercy was the greatest revenge, because it proved that we were worthy of survival, and they were not. Mira looked out at the crowd that had gathered, and at the cameras that carried her words to 1,000 worlds. They thought we would break, but we did not break, and they thought we would forget, but we remembered every name. And they thought we were small, but we showed them that size is not what matters. What matters is what you do with your strength when you finally have it. The Vethkai used their strength to murder the innocent, and we used our strength to protect the innocent, even when those innocents were the children of our enemies. That is humanity, and that is who we are. And that is why in all the stars of all the galaxies you should never give us a reason to go to war. She placed her hand on the statue and spoke her final words. But if you do give us that reason, then know this and know it well. We will remember, and we will prepare, and we will come for you with a force that will make the galaxy tremble. And when we have won, we will offer you the same choice we offered the Vethkai. You can accept our mercy and live with the shame of what you tried to do, or you can refuse and face the full weight of human vengeance. The choice has always been yours. Choose wisely. The memorial stood in silence as Myra walked away, and the statue of the little girl with the burned photograph watched over the garden where the names of 2.3 million souls were carved in white stone. They would never be forgotten, and humanity would never be weak again.